If you're a fan of 16-bit sports games, then let me introduce you to the Accolade Sports Collection. This brand new compilation sees Atari and QUByte Interactive teaming up to bring us 5 classic sports games from the early 1990s. I'm talking about both the Genesis debut of Hardball and the PC sequel, Hardball II, as well as Olympic-style minigame collections like Winter Challenge and the 1993 follow-up, Summer Challenge. Wrapping things up is the addition of Barkley Shut Up and Jam, which has since been retitled Hoops Shut Up and Jam, due to some licensing issues, of course. These are all well-known classics from Accolade's library, but are any of them actually worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Video Games and Computer Entertainment, Machines Sega, and more classic magazines to see what the critics said back when these games first came out. Ooh, I sure hope you have your jockstrap ready, because it's time for another bone-crunching episode of QUByte Classics Review Crew. You want to know why Accolade's Hardball was such a big deal? Really, all you need to do is compare the influential baseball game to the competition at the time, and the difference is night and day. In a world full of tiny, rudimentary sprites, Hardball offered large and expressive athletes that looked like they were pulled straight out of the television. It also controlled well, laying out the groundwork for how to not only pitch and hit, but also field the ball. When I went back and played the original computer version in the Atari 50 compilation, I was struck by how easy it was to get into, even decades later. And that, along with the impressive visuals and intuitive gameplay, is why everybody was so excited to play Hardball on the Genesis. Let's see what the critics said about this early 16-bit baseball game. Alright, so the problem with the Genesis version is that it came out 4 years later, at a time when the competition was starting to catch up a little bit. Perhaps that's why you saw Electronic Gaming Monthly give this port an average score of 7 out of 10. Martin complained that he doesn't like the reverse perspective of the batter and the pitcher. It totally makes the batting a frustrating event. The graphics are very good and the sound is great. Real voices call out the plays. Not a whole lot of options here, but a solid game of baseball. I like the batting cages. Ed, on the other hand, called Hardball easily one of the best playing baseball games around. Great graphics, and the pitcher-batter screen is exceptional. Lots of pitches to choose from, and a wide variety of subtle moves and options are built in. It'll take some time to really learn how the game plays. While the score from EGM is certainly low, it's not the lowest. That distinction belongs to Sega Power, who gave the game a 61%. Video Games and Computer Entertainment agreed with Ed and Martin, giving the game a 7 out of 10. And then there's Machines Sega, who went with a slightly better 75% in their first issue, while Megatech gave it the exact same score, also in their first issue. A decent baseball game which doesn't have enough novel or interesting features to make it appeal to anyone other than real fans of the sport. On the higher side, you have EGM's sister publication, Megaplay, giving the game an average score of 8 out of 10, while the top score goes to GamePro, who went with a perfect 5 out of 5. Hardball is the first 16-bit baseball game that I can recommend. Sure, there aren't a whole lot of 16-bitters out there to choose from, but all you need is one good one, right? Hardball has that great balance of action and strategy that's so important in great sports carts. So get your butt off the bench and grab a bat. It's time to play some Hardball. While certainly not as iconic as the 1987 original, this Genesis port still plays a solid game of baseball. Had this been a few years earlier, I suspect the scores would have been a lot higher. But as it is, Hardball hits a double and comes up with an average score of 76%. My oh my. Two years after shaking up the world of baseball with the original Hardball, Accolade returned with a PC-only sequel that improved and expanded on everything that people loved about the original. I'm talking about massive updates to the stat keeping, the frames of animation, the gameplay, and even modes. This was the game that introduced a team editor, league play, ability to shift the infield and outfield, TV-style instant replays, and even pickoffs, all while giving us several new stadiums to play in. These changes made an already great sports game that much better, and was a must-have for computer-owning baseball fans. And while this particular version never came out on home consoles, many of the improvements found their way into future releases on both the Genesis and the Super NES. Unfortunately, there just aren't any reviews to talk about, so instead, we're going to move on to a couple of sports compilations. For as long as there have been home consoles, there have been sports-themed minigame compilations. From winter games on the Atari 2600, to Konami's Track and Field series, to countless versions of California games. It felt like you were getting one hell of a deal with a bunch of wildly different sports that were crammed into a single cartridge. This was the selling point for Winter Challenge, the 1992 Genesis game giving up to 10 players a chance to compete against each other in bobsledding, ski jumping, luging, downhill, cross country, and more. While hardly the first game to bring these winter sports together, this 16-bit game added all the bells and whistles, including a controllable replay mode. In a year that was dominated by the Summer Olympics, let's go ahead and see what the critics thought of Winter Challenge. Once again, Electronic Gaming Monthly finds themselves at the very bottom of the scale, giving Winter Challenge a shockingly low 4 out of 10. Steve gave it a 3, arguing that this game fails to capture any of the excitement you'd expect if you were competing in such winter sports. Many of the game's events are simply repackaged over again, and the cart really falls short when it comes to graphic and animation presentation. It's a lot of fun to wipe out, but the gameplay just isn't there. Steve agreed, though liked the game a little bit more. I had hopes that this cart would be a great Winter Olympic sports sim. While many of the sports are there, they all aren't the best ever done on this system. Some of the events are really hard to master the controls, and I really had hoped that the graphics would have been better. As is, the game is only average. Now, before you get the wrong impression about Winter Challenge, it's worth noting that EGM was the outlier here. In fact, the next lowest score is from Megatech, who gave the Sports Collection a 62%, quite an improvement. In fact, even EGM's sister magazine Megaplay gave it an average of 7 out of 10, while Game Informer went with an average of 7.2 out of 10. Rick, the video ranger, concluded that Winter Challenge is fun to play and easy on the eyes, but it tends to be slightly repetitive and might get tiresome a little sooner than you'd like. While it's arguably a fun game, I'd like to see variety in the action to match the incredible audio and visuals. Moving up the scale, we see Sega Power give the game a 78%, while Sega Pro went a tick higher with a 79%. Speaking of magazines with Sega in their name, Sega Force gave it an 80%, while Mean Machines Sega went all the way up to an 85%. Participate in 8 Olympic events in this fine winter sports fest. The graphics are a bit patchy, but overall, this is a fine game that's highly recommended to sports fans. Believe it or not, there were magazines that actually liked it even more than that. GamePro once again gave an Accolade Sports game a perfect score of 5 out of 5, while GameZone went slightly higher, giving it a 6 out of 5. Yeah, they called it a Megazone game, the absolute best of the best. Superb winter sports game to let you try your hand at the luge, speed skating, bobsled, giant slalom, biathlon, downhill, cross country, and ski jump without having to embark on a bone-crunching Thompson's winter holiday. A sim so real you can see the peak, feel the snow, even hear the cowbells. One of the best reasons to buy a Mega Drive yet. From EGM calling it one of the worst games of the year, to not one, but 2 different magazines giving it a perfect score, the reviews for Winter Challenge were all over the place. I ended up enjoying it quite a bit when I played it in the Accolade Sports Collection, but clearly there's not a lot of agreement on this game. One year after wowing Genesis owners with winter games, Accolade dared gamers to take off the fluffy coat and put on a pair of running shorts. Summer Challenge is everything the winter game was, only this time with nicer weather. Once again, up to 10 people can compete against each other in 8 adrenaline-pumping events, including kayaking, pole vaulting, cycling, archery, and more. With updated graphics and brand new modes, this collection of summer games was going for the gold. Let's see if they got there. While the reviews for Winter Challenge were all over the place, there was a lot more agreement when it came to Summer Challenge. Across the board, the critics that liked the winter version were universally disappointed with this summer edition. Sega Power, for example, went from giving Winter Challenge a 78% to giving Summer Challenge the lowest grade of the bunch, a 51%. Similarly, GamePro went from giving the first game a perfect 5 out of 5 to giving the sequel a 3 out of 5. They concluded that this game's high point comes when your athlete plows headfirst into an obstacle. Accolade's always done Rex well. The events are fun for a while, and the unique graphic perspective is worth a look. However, the repetitive action and slow gameplay are frustrating. Summer Challenge qualifies for the final heat, but it's a long shot for a medal. Further up the list, we see Mean Machines go from an 85% all the way down to a 67%, while Sega Force Mega couldn't muster up anything higher than a 69%. Nice. Believe it or not, the highest score comes from Video Games and Computer Entertainment, who didn't even bother to review Winter Challenge. Perhaps Summer Challenge was to be released last year to coincide with the Olympics, and planned so before Accolade ran into trouble over its status as an unofficial Genesis third party. How else to explain its dated idea and the fact that it seems to have been taken right off the shelf where it was put away? Problem is, somebody forgot that Summer Challenge hadn't been debugged and decided to release it. Wait, how else do you explain this coming out in 1993? Well, I suppose it could have something to do with the fact that Winter Challenge came out in 1992. In fact, the original PC version of Winter Challenge came out in 1991, with the console port coming out 1 year later. Similarly, Summer Challenge hit PC in 1992 and then came out on the Genesis 1 year later. I mean, maybe it has something to do with the whole Sega third-party craziness, but I suspect that it just took them some time to port the game from computer to console. That's it. After dabbling in the minigame space for a couple of years, Accolade returned in 1993 with a more traditional sports game. This time around, the target was basketball, and the publisher felt like they had the perfect guy to deliver the message. I'm talking about Sir Charles Barkley. Going with a surprisingly aggressive name, Barkley Shut Up and Jam, this is a b-ball game that is desperately trying to be NBA Jam. With no revs, no uniforms, and a relaxed set of rules, this is classic street ball, something that helped to set it apart from other basketball games of the era. It would eventually go on to spawn a sequel in 1995, though that game has been mysteriously left out of the Accolade collection. When it comes to the reviews, once again, the critics were all over the place. One magazine that refused to shut up was Mega, who gave Sir Charles the lowest score of 54%. That's real close to the 56% that we saw from Computer and Video Games, who theorized that if Barkley arrived before Acclaim's NBA Jam, there'd be a reason to buy it. However, it hadn't, and NBA Jam is the better game. In Barkley, the animation is slower, and you occasionally have to wait for the screen to scroll to show where the ball has landed. This is clumsy, but basically the promise of a more fun game thanks to the lack of real sports rules hasn't been lived up to. Yes, it's got fancy moves like NBA Jam, but it's difficult to get a chance to use these since your opponent is always knocking you to the ground. Alright, don't worry, the review scores do get better, but only gradually. Australia's own Hyper gave it a 61%, Well, Sega Magazine went with a disappointing 62%. That's more or less the same as Nintendo Power's 3.1 out of 5. Sir Charles brings his brand of hoops to the Super NES in this rough and tumble tribute to the pure neighborhood roots of the NBA. They praised the fast action, especially for 2 to 4 players. However, the play may seem similar to NBA Jam, but the feel is less polished. While Shut Up and Jam obviously had a hard time shaking the comparisons, there were magazines who felt like the two sports games could coexist. For example, Superplay gave it a solid 73%, making it their 299th best reviewed Super NES game of all time. Mean Machines Sega went a tick higher, giving it a 74%, while Sega Power went with a respectable 77%. However, the highest score once again comes from GamePro, who gave Barkley a score of 4 out of 5. Despite the high score, their review was quick to complain about the gameplay. Controls are inconsistent, unfortunately. Sometimes they're responsive, but other times, as when the computer goes up for a shot, you're unable to jump quickly enough to block it. Still, this is an excellent game. Want it rough? Shut up and jam! Look, Barkley's Shut Up and Jam was never going to outscore the mighty NBA Jam. But you know what? It still has a few things going for it. A lot of this criticism is valid, yet I still had a good time playing it in the Accolade Collection. That said, I do miss Sir Charles. Hoops, Shut Up and Jam just doesn't have the same ring to it.